Aloha, everybody. Hi. So I'm here for our happy hour book club. I tried to do it over Zoom, and only a couple people showed up. I think maybe the time wasn't great for everybody. So I thought I'd come back. We'll do like a take two, and I just wanted to share a little bit about this book because I am obsessed. I really love this. The book is, so our January book is Burnout, The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle, by Dr. Emily Nagoski. And I just, every time that I sit down to read this or I listen to the audio, I pick up something new. Like I have listened and re-listened to this book and read it and reread this book so many times. And there's just so many little like gems all throughout. And so I wanted to hop on, wanted to just share some of my takeaways. And then I would love if anyone who's watching, has read the book or is thinking about reading the book, or if there's anything that I share that's speaking to you, definitely comment and let me know. I want to just start with like a quick wellness check-in though, right? So if you can kind of take a moment to just check in with how you're feeling in this moment. So on a scale of 1 to 10 of stress, where are you right at this moment? So if 10 is the most stressed and 1 is the least stressed, if you're watching, let me know, comment, right? So where are you? How stressed are you at this exact moment? I know for me, I'm a little lower on the stress scale at this exact moment. I would say I'm probably at like maybe like a 4. I definitely have had my moments though, right? Where I've been at like a 9 or a 10. And so I think what we want to talk about and what this book, Burnout, talks about is how to manage those like moments of really high intense stress. And most importantly, like what can you do in your daily, Tamara, thanks for sharing. Tamara said she's at an 8 feeling sad today. You know, I actually think, Tamara, though, that one of the most important things, and I'll talk about this, that she mentions in this book is actually, one, being able to recognize where you are on a scale of stress, but also being able to put words to it, being able to verbalize. And one of the things that we know, oh, Lori Ann, I'm happy to hear that you're down to a 5.5 after being at a 10. Yeah, that's good. That's good that it's lowering. You know, I think that what tends to happen is that we sometimes don't even realize that we're running around at like a 7 or even a 6 or even an 8 sometimes, right? And it's like we're getting, like that becomes normal, I guess. Does that make sense? It's almost like our stress levels are, at, at a high place, but we don't even realize that they're that high. So one of the things that she talks about, because I imagine that if I was to ask you guys, like, where do you want to be on that stress scale? I'm guessing you would tell me you probably want to be a little lower, right? You probably want to be at like a 1 or a 2. And so in this book, she talks about, and I've mentioned this before in my talks, but basically that emotions are tunnels, right? And so the idea is that all emotions have a beginning, a middle, and an end, which I think is a fascinating idea because no one really teaches us how to be with our emotions through the tunnel. And so what she says is that she says, if you go all the way through the tunnel, if you get to the light at the end, then that's kind of how we make it through. Like if we're able to actually sit through that and be with ourselves through that tunnel of emotion, then we can get to the light at the end. She says exhaustion happens when we get stuck in an emotion and we can't move through the tunnel. And I think this is what I see most in my practice is that as women, I think definitely men struggle with this too though, but I see this a lot, that like we never learned how to be with our emotions, right? Or we maybe feel trapped in the emotions somehow and we're unsure kind of how to move through that. So, and the other big one though that she mentions, and she talks a lot about this in the book, is this idea of human giver syndrome. So Dr. Nagoski basically says that as women, we tend to sometimes take on this like human giver syndrome where we believe that somehow like it's our responsibility to give to everyone else but not to ourselves, right? And I think that comes probably from our maternal instinct and that tend and befriend sort of thing that we have as women. But how detrimental if that's how we're operating. It's just constantly giving to other people and never really taking time for ourselves. And so So one of the things that she does talk about, and she talks about the difference between stress and stressors, which I'm going to get to. But she says the good news is that stress is not the problem, which I think is interesting. She says the problem is that the strategies to deal with the stressors basically have no relationship to the strategies, and I'm just reading this from my notes, with the strategies that deal with the physiological reactions that our bodies have to those stressors. And that's what I'm going to talk about in a minute, is sort of the like physiological reaction that our body has to stress. So she says to be well is not to live in a state of perpetual safety and calm, but to move fluidly from a state of adversity, risk, adventure, or excitement back to safety and calm, and then out again. So basically what she's saying is that stress is not bad for you. Being stuck is bad for you. And that's actually, I think, a really important point, that stress itself is adaptive, right? Like that's how we've learned to survive and adapt over the years. So some stress is okay. It's that when stress is prolonged, or when that stress is like maladaptive, like it becomes negative for our health, right? It becomes really dangerous and detrimental to our health. And I'm going to talk about why in a minute. Before I kind of dive more into some of that like physiology, I guess what I wanted to ask, because I'm just curious, so if emotions are tunnels, or are like tunnels, right? I'm wondering, like, which emotions do you tend to get stuck in? So if you kind of think about your own range of emotions, like where do you tend to get stuck? And what I see, in my own private practice, within my therapy practice, and actually with my wellness clients, I see that a lot of us tend to get stuck either in sadness or in anger or anxiety, right? And so I think that we don't always know what tools to use to like move through some of those more difficult or like bigger emotions. And loneliness is another one. Actually, you know what is another huge one that I tend to see is, thanks, Lorianne. Lorianne said anxiety. I was going to say guilt. That was the one that was coming to me. You said guilt, rejection, overwhelm, low self-esteem. Thank you. I totally agree. So guilt and shame, I think, are such tricky emotions. And sometimes we don't really know what to do with those, right? And that manifests often as anxiety. So I think when we're talking about, our emotional health and the concept of like emotional intelligence, rejection. I so feel that. Tamara said rejection is why she's feeling sad today. I'm sorry to hear that. And also, I think that there's a lot that we can take from that and learn from that, actually, because I have so much to say about that, actually. I think rejection tends to be something that we have two choices, right? Like either we're feeling as though we are, like if someone rejects us, we take it personally. We feel like we've done something, it's our fault that they rejected us. When in reality, more often than not, if we're feeling rejection, it's likely due to the other person and their own issues and their own reasons for why maybe they rejected us. But we tend to often sort of personalize that and take that on. And that creates sadness. So Tamara, I totally feel you. What I was going to say though is that I think that when it comes to emotional intelligence and our own emotional health, that there's several different components to it. And she does talk about this in the book, like sort of the idea of emotional health and the importance of our own self-awareness and our ability to manage our emotions and regulate our emotions, right? As well as also having awareness of other people and their needs. The problem is that, again, that human giver syndrome, we tend to put other people's needs and emotions before our own. Right? And so then the last piece of emotional intelligence is also this like relationship management component. Basically, the part of us that, is maintaining healthy relationships through certain skills, through communication, conflict resolution, right? Learning how to not fall prey to some of those like codependence and some of those issues that can come up. One of the things that I found really interesting about this book and that I really loved is that Emily Nagoski basically says that wellness is not a state of being or a state of mind. She believes it's a state of action. So she says it's moving freely through all the tunnels, cycles, and oscillations of being human. And I think that that's so true. I mean, it's really interesting because I always think of wellness as a state of being, in the sense of like, we're such human doers as opposed to human beings. Like we tend to do more than be. But what I think she means by saying that actually wellness is a state of action is essentially that we have to take a conscious step. Like we have to take a conscious make a conscious effort and put conscious effort towards moving through the tunnel, moving through our emotions. And she calls this completing the cycle, and I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. What I sort of teach and believe with my as a licensed clinical social worker, as a therapist, but also as a yoga teacher, I believe that wellness is sort of the alignment of body, mind, and spirit. And for me, I teach a lot of essentially how to move into wellness through different tools. One of which is the breath, right? Which is a really big one, I think, in yoga. And we talk about sort of with the practice of yoga, how actually the breath is what really connects us. It is literally connected when we take deep inhale and exhalation breaths. And I've mentioned before about the vagus nerve. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in just a moment. But the concept that a deep exhalation stimulates the vagus nerve, which is a nerve that basically runs from the tailbone to the brain. And it's a nerve that sends a message to our nervous system, allowing us to shift from that fight or flight state of stress or anxiety into our parasympathetic relaxation response. So a lot of what I see, though, in, again, within my practice is common barriers, I think, to wellness. So I think heightened stress, obviously. I mean, the pandemic obviously has been a huge stressor, but I think also, untreated mental illness is a common barrier to wellness. I think that many of us are walking around with limiting beliefs and cognitive distortions. I think so learning what those even are and how to reframe those can be super healing. I see also as common barriers to wellness, like perfectionism, like I've mentioned, codependence, low energy, low motivation. That ties in a little bit to untreated mental illness, specifically to depression or anxiety. But also I see a common barrier to wellness is just sort of poor sleep, right? Not getting enough sleep, not eating well, our poor nutrition. Another one is actually not having enough social support, limited social support, can leave us feeling really low energy, low motivation, right? We just are isolated. And that can lead to some unhealthy coping strategies, sometimes turning to substances or turning to things that almost end up being sort of crutches, and other extreme behaviors, whether it's addiction or something else. So I think those are sometimes the things that we see that can get in the way of our wellness. And I, like to teach a whole bunch of different tools as how to sort of overcome some of those barriers. But one of the things I wanted to talk about, because she mentions this, this is a big piece of the book, is understanding the difference between a stress and a stressor. And basically that a stressor is essentially activating our body's stress response cycle. So it's something that you can see, you can hear, you smell, touch, taste, or imagine. Basically, if you are perceiving something externally as something that could do you harm, something that you are perceiving as a threat, then your body immediately goes into that stress response cycle. And that's what's interesting. My perception or appraisal of stress is different from other people's appraisal of stress. So stress itself is really a neurological or a physiological shift that happens in our body when we encounter a stressor or a threat. But again, the stressor itself is some external stimuli, right? It's something that we are perceiving as a threat, as something that could do us harm. And so that's important, because if we have untreated mental illness, if we have untreated or unhealed trauma, sometimes it's our body is basically misperceiving stimuli as something that is, essentially, thanks, Lorianne, see you later. That is essentially, it's we're perceiving a threat in the absence of a threat, right? We're not feeling safe. And so a lot of what we have to learn, and a lot of what I teach, is basically how to feel safe in your body, how to feel, safe in your environment, how to essentially rewire your nervous system a little bit. And that's what I just wanted to mention quickly, is that, I think our sympathetic and our parasympathetic nervous system are so, they're just really deeply connected. I mean, because they are part of the stress response cycle. And so I wanted to just share that basically the human stress response cycle consists of 3 parts. This is one of the theories by a psychologist, Hans Selye, who came up with this idea of the general adaptation syndrome, basically saying that, our first response to stress is to go into like alarm stage. Basically, our body is like mobilizing all of its resources. We start having this outpouring of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, and that's what kickstarts the fight or flight or the sympathetic nervous system reaction. And what happens, unfortunately or fortunately, is that basically when there is a stressor, so like a prolonged stressor, the pandemic, for example, we go into resistance mode. That's really stage 2 of the general adaptation syndrome of stress. So it's sort of like our body is basically trying to get us or allow us to cope with the stressor by continuing to just like, pour out these stress hormones. And that can be dangerous long-term for our body for a lot of reasons. But I think what eventually happens is our reserves get depleted, and then we enter the last stage of that stress response cycle, which is exhaustion. And that sometimes even can be fatal. I mean, it can lead to terminal illness. And what happens is that like cortisol, for example, can, basically build up in our arteries. And that's what sort of creates this like almost like this plaque that can lead to some, heart disease and hypertension and various things that when we reach exhaustion can, be like a tipping point for our health. And so I think one of the things that is so important in my takeaway from this book, Burnout, is basically that, she is talking about the importance of completing the stress response cycle, so that, because if we never, I think I have a quote actually in here, hang on. So basically she says, the stress itself will kill you faster than the stressor will, unless you do something to complete the stress response cycle. She says, while you're managing the day's stressors, your body is managing the day's stress, and it's absolutely essential to your well-being that you give your body the resources that it needs to complete the stress response cycles that have been activated. And so she talks about like many different ways that you can complete the stress response cycle. Basically, exercise is the simplest, right? That in and of itself is a release for our body and ends that outpouring of all those stress hormones, right? But there are other ways to have that release. So it could be a cathartic release like crying, right? Releasing the emotion itself. Laughter, actually, belly laughter is a huge one. And interestingly enough, triggers the vagus nerve. It stimulates the vagus nerve, sending a message to our brain to induce the body's relaxation response, which I think is super interesting. Some other, ways to complete the cycle of stress: you can talk to a friend or a therapist, right? So that's emotion-focused coping. You can turn to some creative outlet, whether it's journaling or art. You can engage basically in a soothing strategy, or into our soothing system, which might be something like using the breathing techniques that I teach, using restorative yoga poses that I teach, meditating, using yoga nidra as a tool basically to get into our soothing system. And I've talked about this before, but I'm kind of obsessed with the whole concept of our systems of emotional regulation, which basically just say that, if we have 3 systems, our drive system, our threat system, and our soothing system. Our drive system is the part of us that's task oriented and needs to be productive all the time and is in go, go, go mode, where many of us, I think, are constantly operating, juggling sort of all of the day's responsibilities. The other part of us is that threat system that essentially is managing threats that we're perceiving around us. So it's kind of like being in survival mode. And like I said, if we have unhealed trauma or untreated mental illness, we are constantly operating under our threat system. And it's like our body is just in constant fight or flight all the time. And so the problem is that if we're sort of somewhere between drive and threat all the time, our soothing system becomes limited, right? It's like our body never gets a chance to slow down, to soothe, to rest, and to get into that parasympathetic, literally rest and digest relaxation response. And one of the things she says, which I think this is fascinating too from the book, she basically says that rest, so she says it's true that rest makes us more productive ultimately, and if that's an argument that helps you persuade your boss to give you more flexibility, awesome. But she says, but we think rest matters not because it makes you more productive, but because it makes you happier and healthier, less grumpy, and more creative. We think rest matters because you matter. You are not here to be productive. You are here to be you, to engage with your, she calls it something larger, whatever that may be, and to move through the world with confidence and joy. And to do that, you require rest. Now, what's interesting is she says, basically, the science tells us that in terms of how much rest is adequate, that we need about 42%. So she says that's the percentage of time that your body and your brain need you to be resting. It's about 10 hours out of every 24, which is interesting. It doesn't have to be every day. It can average out over a week or a month or more, but she says, yeah, that much, right? So again, what is that? About 10 hours out of every 24 hours. And I'm just reading this quote because I love it. She says, that's ridiculous. I don't have that kind of time. You might protest. And we remind you that we predicted you might feel that way. And she says, we're not saying you should take 42% of your time to rest. We're saying if you don't take the 42% will take you. She says it will grab you by the face, shove you to the ground, put its foot on your chest, and declare itself the victor. And I just think that's so true. Like, that's exactly what I was talking about. Basically, that if you don't make time for your body to rest, whatever that looks like, and I personally believe that that's getting into your soothing system. That's, practicing radical self-love and taking care of yourself, putting your needs first, and actually, getting into your body's rest and digest system. So whether that's like a restorative yoga pose before bed, or a meditation, or just a quick, grounding technique, a big grounding technique I like to teach, just to take a moment to move into the present moment, is something as simple as 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 5 things I see in this moment, 4 things I hear in this moment, 3 things I smell in this moment, 2 things I touch, 1 thing I taste, right? Something that just allows you to be present, right? So there's so many different ways that you can practice intentional rest, that you can come into the present moment and be present with yourself and your experience. But I think that so many of us don't make time for that. And I think that, to me, was the big takeaway from this book, that if you don't do that, if you don't make time to complete the cycle, you're going to burn out. And that is sort of the whole idea here. And that, so that kind of begs the question of well, what does completing the stress response cycle look like in your life? For me, I'm just going to share something that my family has started doing, which I really am loving and appreciating. We've started doing family dinner or family dance parties after dinner, which is so silly. But after, being in sessions all day within my therapy practice, and my son, who's 3 years old, just loves to dance and move his body, it's hard for him to sit at the dinner table for a long time. And so my husband would start playing music and we would start dancing. And then before I knew it, we're all up and dancing and having a great time. That, to me, is my way every night of completing the cycle. Some days I try to exercise if I can and get up early and work out. That's a great way to do it. I know for me also, I am definitely a venter. I need to be able to, talk about my feelings and share about them. So I absolutely value and appreciate the girlfriends in my life, my own therapist who I talk to, as a way to complete the stress cycle. I think you have to find what works for you. I also really listen to what my body is needing, so a big thing that I say to my clients is what are you needing in this moment? Listen to what you're needing and give that to yourself. So there's some days or nights where I know that what I need is to veg out and watch Grey's Anatomy. I'm just going to do that. There are other nights where I know, and as if I really check in, what I need is not to numb out, but instead to set up a little restorative yoga space for myself and just do a couple of poses before bed, or to meditate. There are some nights that's what I'm needing to complete the cycle. I know that if I don't make that time, I will start to burn out. I can tell you last week, for example, it wasn't a particularly stressful week for me, but one thing that I was so grateful that I did was I made time, 1, to work out 3 days, which was huge for me, but 2, last Friday I got to go for a beach walk with a friend, and that was just hugely helpful in completing the cycle, just to be outdoors, to get some fresh air, to talk to a girlfriend, right? All of those things I think are so, so helpful. And we don't value those enough. I think that, like I said, limited social support sometimes actually can be a barrier to our wellness. And so one of the things that we know is that like connection and social support is a protective factor. It's huge. So one of the things that I would encourage you, whatever that looks like in your life, is surround yourself with conscious company and people who support you, who you can talk to, who can remind you to complete the cycle, right? To hold up the mirror for you when you need that reminder to take care of yourself. I know that, I know I've shared about this and I've posted about this, but this coming Friday, I'm starting my course, my 8-week course in mastering emotional intelligence. And we've got I think we have almost 10 women in the group right now. And it's just going to be such a magical container. Like I'm feeling so excited because I know that this is going to be both a sort of process oriented, but also a content oriented circle and course. And we're going to be covering all of this stuff. Like we're going to be diving deeper, to look at sort of, what are some like neuro strategies that we can use for stress management. We'll be looking at, healthier ways to manage our mental health, social emotional tools for like empathy and communication and conflict resolution, self-compassion, right? So, and we'll be diving into sort of limiting beliefs and how to reframe our cognitive distortions and, master sort of our radical self-love. And I'm even bringing somebody in to help us get a better sort of feel more confident around our finances, because I think that can be, a big, something that creates a lot of fear for us as women. And I'm really feeling like, this particular course is going to be a way for me to be able to support and be in service of, the women that are in this group. If it's calling to you at all, know that scholarships are available. I really didn't want cost to be a determining factor in this. So if it speaks to you, reach out. We'll be starting, it's going to be every Friday for 8 weeks. And I think it's at 2 p.m. Hawaii time, which is 7 p.m. Eastern time. So, in any case, you guys, I hope that you are, that this was helpful, that you enjoyed this. Truthfully, my hope is that like we could actually have a book club where I can see your faces and we can interact and engage, and I can actually answer questions, and hear other things that are on your mind around your own stress. But know that I'm here, I'm available, and whatever that looks like, whether you decide to participate in the course or you just want to reach out and, talk through Messenger, or you want to set up a wellness alignment session, I'm here to support you. And just know that like what matters is that you make time to essentially take care of yourself and to complete your stress response cycle. That's my biggest takeaway from this book. I definitely recommend that you go out and either buy the book or listen to the audio. You'll get a lot from it, and it's just a really, I think, healthy, helpful reminder. So I hope that this has been helpful, you guys, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. I'll do some more sharing in the group shortly. Okay, take care, everybody. Happy Monday. Aloha.